After Maddie had begun to experience some bad attacks, I saw my first ghost in Chase Franks, or at least the first I can recall as a sentient and presumably still sane adult, possibly excepting the cabalistic attendant in the downstairs toilets at Wigan Casino. Yes, I had been drinking, but I saw a man move across my line of sight, who I felt to be a bule, but had the stature of an Indonesian. He was dressed in a light brown western suit. I thought little of it. After all, I'd had a few beers and being preoccupied with the paranormal, I was open to suggestion. Alcohol, quite apart from raising doubts about my vision, also makes one more susceptible to such events. Possibly, as some have suggested, as drinking alcohol, even alcoholic ghosts attach themselves to living drinkers. However, for those of you that have never had such an experience, let me reassure you that there was nothing at all frightening about it. It was rather like watching a grainy movie. From that time on, the dead have become even more distinct to me as the voices of the unanswered, unresolved and unredeemed. Comment made by Carl Young. On my way back to the toilet, I studied some photos on the wall. I couldn't believe what I saw. A band dressed in those same light brown suits. Although I'd not seen the face of the ghost, I knew somehow it wasn't a band member. I ran my hand along the glass separating me from the photos, but I could not identify who I had seen. I returned to Maddie and Ibu Annie, a staff member who lived in Pondok Indah and who had been married to a Danish man who she believed she lost through black magic. But she now lives all alone in a very expensive home with limited income, whilst her husband has now returned to Denmark demented. I told Ibu Annie what I had seen, and she said it must be Frank. I'd heard of Frank and I was aware of the bar's celebrity connections, although knew little more about him, but felt she must be correct. Later that night I kept feeling Frank's presence, particularly on a bar stool facing me, rather than the bar. But he did not show himself to me again. He kept moving around the bar, sometimes sitting next to me. He appeared to be playing tricks on me. However, he did reassure me not to worry about Maddie and told me that the Naga we had thought had possessed her was simply a ghost. I asked him for his help and he said he would do what he could, but that Maddie and I could do it all on our own, just like Pa Angabaya had indicated. I was explaining some of this to Ibu Annie when Frank's son Jan must have overheard me. He came over and asked me what I was talking about. I explained that I was British and had been agnostic, believing neither in God nor ghosts. I could not explain what was happening, but it was very real. I pointed to the bar and then said that his father was a joker. Jan looked shocked. Yes, his father was always joking, and that had been his favourite stool. He would sit there, never towards the bar, but always away from it, looking at his customers. Jan took me to the photos and pointed out his father. I felt nothing, but wrote this off, as this was my first experience and I was only learning. After all, the evidence, whilst not compelling to a Western scientist, there was just too many variables appearing correct for this merely to be random guesses from information I had unknowingly picked. We decided to return home via Block Square. I cannot remember why, as it was hardly on the way home, giving our route more of a triangular shape. Like most Indonesians, Maddie had no mental image of Jakarta and its roads. Maybe nor do most bullets, but I had now digested huge sections of Google Maps with gusto. We obviously needed to buy something. I remember going to Carrefour, where we would shop as a cheaper alternative to Lotte. As we drove along semi-familiar streets, as this was not a route I often took, I felt Frank's presence in the taxi. He explained to me that that when we die, we remain on this earth, but in another realm. If I looked closely enough, I would be able to see the ghosts. Sure enough, I looked out of the taxi window and they were everywhere. Again, not frightening, not absolutely clear, and again like watching a grainy movie superimposed on my eyeballs. I say not frightening, but there were some hanging out of windows and screaming and waving their arms, almost in a cartoon-like manner, as on a ghost train. I wondered if Frank's understanding was coloured by his Christian background, as I wasn't clear that what he told me did not seem to fit with some Kajawan explanations, and certainly with not those of most Muslims. Less so Indonesian Muslims do not believe in ghosts and see all paranormal activity as the work of jinns. Although I also knew that there were various esoteric veils of Kajawan learning, none resembling the last. Maddie being exposed to a very high level by a nanny, whilst her brother had stopped long before this. As I later learned, ghosts do not necessarily know more than some of the living about such issues, so I am more than willing to accept that my revelations from Frank are false, or more probably incomplete. When we got to Block M, I was aghast, still not frightened, but it was absolutely full of ghosts, as were the neighbouring streets, especially at the intersections, far more than there were living people. Again, it was more like watching a grainy movie, and despite the numbers, once again I felt no fear whatsoever. In fact, I felt like I'd received a great revelation. The whole house filled as if there was a crowd present, crammed full of spirits. They were packed deep right up to the door, and the air was so thick that it was scarcely possible to breathe. Carl Jung, Memoirs, Dreams and Reflections. Thank you so much, Frank. It was like a large part of the meaning of life, or more precisely death, had been revealed to me in a flash. I felt absolutely elated at my new knowledge and a compelling desire to share it. I use the word knowledge throughout, but being precise, I should really call it belief, as it cannot be proved by science. The ground floor of Block M is mostly stores selling distro fashion, but it has its fair share of Chinese gold exchanges, Toko Emas China. As I passed each Chinese store, I could feel evil radiating from it, and then I came to a Padang Chinese store at one of the entrances. The feeling was so overpowering it gave me a headache, and I had to sit down a little away from it. However, it looks similar to all the other gold exchanges in Block M, full of glass cases with jewellery and glass counters also full of jewellery. The displays were interspersed with Chinese ornaments, often with red tassels hanging from them, and incongruous metallic cats waving their right arms. Nothing at all sinister, despite the overwhelming evil I could feel. I had learned that the first thing you do when you become aware of a ghost or ghosts is to talk to them. When I knew their presence not to be a positive force, I would at first speak to them in an arcane language and use commands. This does not work anything like as well as speaking normally and with compassion. You don't need to talk out loud just in your head, although sometimes actually speaking the words helps. Despite many Kajawan Dukan believing that it's best to use ancient Javanese to communicate, I am not alone in having found that ghosts can understand any language, although it is possible that Dukan can communicate to a wider range of ghosts. Once you have opened a channel of communication, ask the ghost their name. Maybe it was my lack of experience, but the first name I get rarely seems to be correct. Ghosts are believed to often lie to try to trick the living, So maybe it is simply due to this. Or those sending ghosts instruct them to trick you. But somehow I believe it's my lack of experience. Or maybe ghosts don't often lie, despite many believing that they do. It is simply that you misunderstand them. One only has to try to decipher the allegories of Victorian Romantic paintings to understand the difficulty in comprehending the past. And I also have a different culture to comprehend. Just as in the world of the living, being able to use someone's name is the first step in establishing an empathy and being able to communicate. But in the spirit world it is more important, because knowing the name enables you to focus energy on a human or ghost. Of course, I had no such problems with my mentor Frank. He had simply come to me and opened me up to his realm. Thus I began speaking to ghosts that had entered the Made. The first one I identified was Chung. He kept correcting my pronunciation of his name, so Chung is just the one I settled on. Chung was a teenage boy of Chinese descent. He didn't seem particularly malevolent, although any malevolent possession will hurt the host, and I think of it as being like a kitten in a small paper bag. Their claws will inevitably rip and tear the bag. He explained that he had died in his home when his home had been set alight in the anti-Chinese riots, during which time his sister was raped before his eyes. To the masjid that Friday, I was a little shocked, as I'd assumed that a ghost, especially a Chinese ghost, would never enter the masjid. During Pa Ustad's address, I continued to speak to Chung, although naturally not during the actual Shaulat. After Shaulat, I had not walked more than 15 metres, and I turned the corner and was on the road which leads to the gangs my home is off, when I became aware of a much more powerful and sinister force. As always, I asked the ghost his name, and he told me that I should call him Chung. He appeared to be mocking me in my newfound powers, and clearly saw himself in a power struggle with me. He was almost threatening, which is why I started to use my threatening style in my communications, but in my experience this doesn't work. It is said that if you are good, with good thoughts, a ghost cannot harm you. So they will attempt to make you angry and seek revenge. You must avoid this. All things will only turn into a spiral of destruction. Overall, I believe that whilst we need to be wary of ghosts, we should also treat them as equals, never subservient nor authoritative. I also feel that my powers were only at an immature stage, so I'm less clear about the next parts to my story. I also believe that Chung had purposely misled me. I began to call the ghost Su Chung and realised that he was the mature Chung, who hadn't died in the fire after all. Su Chung seemed to prefer me to address him as the boy Chung. He told me that this was because I was more compassionate when I did so. But it may have been that I had less power over the mature Su Chung. A major breakthrough and something of a bombshell came when I asked the boy Chung where his home had been that had been set alight. Here was his reply. I was expecting to say Glodok or Senin or one of the other centres of Chinese Indonesians in the city. Wait, so Su Chung must be Ma's husband and therefore Ibu Erti's father? I was completely shocked, but now realise that I should have worked this out much sooner, as the living have much more power over their ancestors than unknown spirits. Well, I guess if you've got this far with listening to me, you at least enjoyed something of what I said. I do hope that you have. And it's actually was extracts from 3 books that I've written that you can find on this channel, The Magic of Java. I'd really love you to subscribe and hit the button, and yeah, please listen to all 3 of my books. But above all, thank you for listening to this.